They told you Greece was the birthplace of civilization, but they never told you about the Africans they stole the homework from. They praised the student and erased the teacher. You've been fed statues of white marble and half-truths in history books. They gave you Plato, but hid Ptah. They gave you Socrates, but buried Imhotep. They said Western philosophy, but never whispered Kemet. Listen, before Greece even knew how to spell philosophy, Africans along the Nile were mapping the stars, measuring the earth, and breaking down the human soul like a science. Before a Greek ever carved a column, black hands were raising pyramids so precise you still can't slide a razor blade between the stones. Yet somehow, the world memorized the student's name and forgot the master's face. This isn't just history. This is robbery dressed up as respectability. This is cultural burglary with a textbook alibi. They turned African genius into mystery. They turned Greek tourism into origin story. They turned your ancestors into a footnote and their copycats into founding fathers. I'm not here to be polite. I'm here to flip the table in your mind. Because once you see how Greece sat at Egypt's feet, you'll never bow to a stolen throne again. Let's talk about how the Greeks learned, borrowed, and straight up looted from the Nile, and how the world was trained to clap for the echo while silencing the original voice. Part 2. Europe loves to pretend it woke up one morning, brushed its little marble teeth, and invented civilization. Nah, let's rewind the tape. Before Greece had a name worth whispering, Africa was already writing in stone. While Europe was still arguing with the cold, Kemet was calculating the stars, measuring the flood of the Nile, mapping the human soul. Before Plato had a republic, Africa had whole kingdoms. Before Aristotle wrote physics, Africans were tracking the seasons, building calendars so precise they made time itself feel late. They tell you Greece is the cradle of Western civilization. Cool story. But a cradle ain't the mother. A cradle just holds the baby. The mother is the one who carried the wisdom, fed it, protected it, and watched it get adopted by somebody else with a louder microphone. Europe came with a notebook. Africa already had libraries. Look at the receipts. Greek philosophers traveling south, not for vacation, but for initiation. They weren't tourists, they were students. They didn't come to teach, they came to sit down, shut up, and learn from black priests and scribes who had been decoding life since Europe was still trying to spell its own name. While Europe was worshiping thunder and guessing at the gods, Africa was mapping the unseen, teaching that the universe is mind, that spirit and matter dance together, that math, music, and morality are different doors to the same house. While Europe was building huts, Africa was raising monuments that still make modern engineers scratch their heads. Stone aligned with stars, temples tuned like instruments to the hum of the cosmos. But when the story gets told, they zoom the camera in on Greece and crop Africa out the frame. They call Greek thought original and African wisdom myth. They call Greek gods classical and African gods primitive. They call Greek science rational and African science mystical. Translation: Europe gets the credit, Africa gets the erasure. They'll praise Pythagoras for the triangle, but won't tell you he studied in Kemet where land, water, and spirit were measured with a sacred math. They'll worship Hippocrates as the father of medicine, but won't show you the medical papyri older than his whole bloodline, listing surgeries, herbs, and diagnoses like a hospital carved in hieroglyphs. Europe repackaged African genius with a Greek label and sold it back to the world as the birth of reason. But understand this, you can't birth what already raised you. You can't claim discovery of a house you entered through the back door. Greece was the student, Africa was the teacher, and once you see that, once you feel that flip in your chest, you'll stop bowing to marble statues and start honoring the black soil those statues secretly studied from. Part 3. Europe had libraries of stone. Africa had libraries of spirit. Europe carved heroes into marble. Africa carved memory into blood. They tell you civilization was born in Athens, under white columns and blue skies, as if the sun didn't rise in the east and kiss the Nile first. Listen, before Plato had a republic, Kemet had a whole cosmos mapped out in temple walls. Before Pythagoras started playing with triangles, African builders were bending stone and starlight into pyramids that still refused to fall. Europe wrote theories. Africa wrote reality. They came to Kemet like thirsty men at a deep well, heads low, scrolls empty, eyes wide at a world that had already mastered math, medicine, music, and the movement of the heavens. But history got edited. The student put on the teacher's robe, stood on the teacher's grave, and said, "Look what I invented." They took black wisdom, washed it in white marble, and called it Western thought. They erased the Nile from the story, but kept the river of ideas flowing. They buried the black face, but kept the black genius. Europe built myths. Africa built methods. Europe said, "We discovered philosophy." Africa smiled, ancient and unbothered, because Ma'at, truth, balance, order, was already law in the hearts of our ancestors, while Europe was still arguing with its own shadows. They want you to believe Africa was just drums and dust, while Greece was light and logic. Nah, Africa was the drum and the data, the rhythm and the reason, the beat and the blueprint. Europe polished the story, Africa lived the story. So when they praised Socrates for questioning everything, remember he was walking a road already paved by black minds who questioned the stars, measured the flood, studied the soul, and turned the chaos of the world into a language of order. Greece was the remix, Africa was the original track, and the world's been dancing to African frequencies ever since, even when they pretend they can't hear the bass. Part 4. Europe showed up late to the party, then tried to DJ like they owned the sound. They walked into Kemet with sandals and questions, left with scrolls, symbols, and stolen blueprints, then had the nerve to call it Greek philosophy. Let's talk plain. Before Plato was pondering, African priests were mapping the stars, measuring the Nile, breaking down the human soul into pieces and paths. Before Aristotle was writing about ethics, African temples were already teaching how to live right, how to balance your heart against truth, how to walk light but stand heavy. Pythagoras, that triangle trick he's famous for, he studied in Egypt, where builders had been using that math to raise pyramids that still humble skyscrapers. Europe wrote the remix in Latin and Greek, but the melody, the rhythm, the heartbeat, that was African. That was Nile bred. That was sun forged. They came to Africa as students, then went home and played professor. They sat at black feet, then stood on black shoulders, then turned around and pretended they climbed there alone. Europe loves to say, Western civilization began with the Greeks, but how you beginning with the students and skipping the teachers? That's like praising the fruit and forgetting the tree, like quoting the quote and erasing the mouth that spoke it. Africa was the classroom, Europe was the notebook. Africa was the library, Europe was the copy machine. They took African science, wrapped it in white marble statues, and called it universal. They took African wisdom, put European names on it, and called it classical. But peel back the paint, dust off the stone, read what's left on the walls of Kemet, you'll see familiar concepts wearing older, blacker faces. Europe gave it a new accent. Africa gave it life. And here's the part they don't like to hear. If Greece is your mother of philosophy, then Egypt is your grandmother, and she's African. So no matter how hard you try to bleach the tree, the roots still sit in black soil. They cannot do last. Argue in textbooks. We point to temples. They can debate in lectures. We point to ruins that still refuse to fall. Europe was learning to crawl while Africa was building stone calendars that kissed the equinox on time, every time. So when they say, the Greeks discovered, hear it correctly. The Greeks visited, studied, borrowed, rebranded, and took credit, because Greece was the remix. Africa was the studio, the engineer, the producer. And history's just now starting to fix the liner notes. Part 5. Europe was still trying to figure out fire and forks while Africa was out here mapping the stars, measuring the flood, talking to the universe in numbers and stone. Don't let the marble statues fool you. Before Greece had philosophers, Kemet had sages. Before they had mythology, we had memory. Before they had reason, we had rhythm and law carved in granite, painted on tomb walls, whispered in temples where the ceilings looked like the night sky itself. They came to the Nile like freshmen acting like founders, sat at the feet of black priests, black scribes, black architects of the unseen, and took notes like their life depended on it. Because it did. Pythagoras, brother studied in Egypt, came back with geometry like he discovered it in a dream. Nah, those right triangles were already holding up pyramids while Greece was still arguing over which god owned the lightning. Plato visited Kemet, walked through libraries that smelled like papyrus and eternity. He saw what a real republic looked like, a people with laws older than his language, ma'at, balance, order, truth, not just as a word, but as the spine of society. He went home and wrote dialogues. Africa already had monuments. Europe wrote theories. Africa wrote time. They call it Western philosophy now, like wisdom was born in a toga. But strip away the Latin, peel off the Greek, and underneath you'll find the brown hands of the Nile holding it up. They rebranded our medicine as Hippocratic, our math as Hellenistic, our spirit science as mystery schools, like it was some side quest instead of the main script. Understand the trick. Europe turned field trips into origin stories. They took study abroad and renamed it civilization. Africa was the teacher. Europe was the transfer student who copied the homework, then told the world they wrote the book. We built temples aligned with the cosmos. They built columns and copied the pose. We charted the soul's journey through death and rebirth. They took the symbols, changed the names, and sold it back as myth. On this side of the Mediterranean, we were calculating the circumference of the earth by watching shadows kiss stone at noon. On that side, they were still debating if the earth was flat, round, or riding on some god's back. On this side, we embalmed bodies because we knew matter is a costume, spirit is the script. On that side, they called it superstition until they could translate it and publish it under their own names. Europe turned our temples into tourist attractions, our gods into pagan idols, our science into esoteric mystery, and our history into a footnote in their textbooks. But here's the part they don't like. You can erase a name from the cover, but you can't change the sound of the music. The rhythm still tells on them. You look at Greek columns, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and you're just looking at stone echoes of African papyrus stalks and lotus blooms. You read their myths of gods dying and rising, and you're just hearing a remixed Osiris with the serial number scratched off. They call it Renaissance, like Europe suddenly woke up on its own. No. Renaissance was Europe breaking into Africa's attic, dusting off old scrolls and acting surprised like they'd found buried treasure instead of stolen inheritance. Africa was the blueprint. Europe was the photocopy with the contrast turned up too high. And the wildest part? They knew. Oh, they knew. The old Greek writers said it plain. If you want knowledge, go to Egypt. But somewhere between parchment and printing press, between empire and museum, that line got lost in translation. So now they teach our children that civilization drifted up from Europe like morning fog, when the truth is it rose from the Nile like the sun itself. Africa was the dawn. Europe was the latecomer claiming they invented daylight. But the light remembers where it first touched the earth. And no matter how many names they carve on the front of the building, the foundation still speaks Medune Ter, the language of the gods, the language of black stone, the language of we were here before your history began. They studied us, they copied us, they renamed us, but they can't replace us, because every time you trace the roots of what they call Western thought, you end up back at the Nile, standing in front of a black mother civilization that the world tried to crop out of the picture. No more cropping, no more silence, no more acting like the student was the teacher. Africa was the studio, the engineer, the producer. Europe was just the intern who stole the demo and dropped it as an album. And now the real credits are rolling back into place. Part 6. Europe wrote the trailer. Africa birthed the film. Let's talk classics, since they love that word so much. They'll tell you Western civilization began in Greece. White columns, marble statues, philosophers in sandals thinking deep thoughts by the sea. Cute story, but here's the director's cut. Before Greece could spell philosophy, Kemet was already doing soul surgery on the mind. While Europe was still arguing with the forest, Nile Valley priests were mapping out the cosmos, measuring the heartbeat of the stars, whispering with the ancestors, building stone prayers that scraped the sky. Europe was a rumor. Africa was a library. They teach you about Plato, but skip the part where he studied in Egypt like a freshman with wide eyes, walking through halls he did not build. They praise Pythagoras for his triangle hustle, but don't mention he sat at the feet of Nile sages, learning math from men who carved geometry into pyramids long before his people could even count their own winners. They shout, Hippocrates, father of medicine. But the medical papyri of Kemet were already old when his grandfather was still chasing goats. This is how it went. Africa opened the door. Europe took notes. Africa shared the blueprint. Europe stamped its logo. Africa taught the class. Europe kept the certificate. They turned stolen lessons into Greek genius. They turned African teachers into mysterious influences. They turned black brilliance into footnotes, then buried the footnotes. They call it Western thought, like it was born in Athens, not imported from the Nile with the serial numbers scraped off. Look close. Socrates asking questions. That's just a remix of African initiation. Know thyself or stay in the dark. Greek myths about gods dying and rising. You've already seen that movie. Alsar, Alset, Heru. Africa wrote that script in stone and starlight before Europe learned how to spell myth. But they flipped the story. They painted Greece in white marble, Africa in shadow. They framed Europe as the thinker, Africa as the background. They sold you the sequel and erased the original. Understand this. Europe is the echo. Africa is the voice. Europe is the translation. Africa is the language. Europe is the highlight reel. Africa is the full game. When you see Greek philosophy, hear African memory in a foreign tongue. When you hear Western science, see Nile water flowing through stolen pipes. They built a whole civilization on borrowed light, then told the sun it was just a reflection. But the spell is breaking. Receipts are resurfacing. The Nile is speaking again, and the stones are tired of being quiet. Because once you know that the Greeks were students, not originators, that Europe was the apprentice, not the architect, you stop bowing to borrowed crowns. You stop worshiping the photocopy. You start looking for the author, and every road, every theorem, every great idea they tried to hoard keeps pointing back to the same black river, the same black soil, the same black mind. Europe wrote its name in chalk. Africa carved its truth in granite. One rain, and the chalk is gone. The stone, still standing. And now the world is waking up to who taught who built what, and whose light they've been living off this whole time. Part 7. Europe wrote the textbook, but Africa wrote the universe. See, Europe gave you chapters. Africa gave you time itself. They gave you philosophy. We gave you the mind they used to think with. They gave you geometry. We gave you the Nile flood, measuring land after the waters rose, turning disaster into discipline, rhythm into reason. They gave you marble statues. We gave you living stone, obelisks that pierce the sky, temples that align with the stars so precise, NASA still double checks. Europe gave you myths. Africa gave you memory. They talk about Zeus in the clouds. We charted Sirius in the dark, mapped the heavens on temple walls, turned the night into a blackboard, and wrote the cosmos in code. They gave you calendars. We gave you eternity. They still arguing about dates. We were sinking human life to the breath of the universe. Solstices, equinoxes, cosmic mathematics baked into stone. They gave you Plato in a toga. We gave you Ta in creation, Tahuti with the pen, Ma'at with the scales, law, logic, balance, truth, long before Europe even knew how to spell order. Europe gave you Western civilization, but Africa gave them civilization, then watched them repackage it, rename it, and sell it back to the world like they invented the sun. They said, Greece was the cradle of thought. Nah, Greece was the student dorm. The real classroom was on the Nile, in temples where priests studied for 40 years before they could even speak on the mysteries. Pythagoras, he studied in Kemet. Plato, he studied in Kemet. Solon, He studied in Kemet. Herodotus walked through our halls, eyes wide, writing down wonders he knew his people wouldn't fully understand. Europe gave you the copy. Africa is the original, but they flipped the script, turned the student into the master into a myth, and told you Egypt was Middle East, like Africa ain't the mother of that very sand. They show you white statues, we show you black stone. They show you philosophers, we show you high priests. They show you ancient genius. We show you ancient memory, ours. Understand this, Greece was a stopover. Africa was the source. They drank from our river, then pretended the water came from their own hands. But the current don't lie. The stones don't lie. The stars don't lie. Europe built the story. Africa built the stage, the script, the language, the lights, and the laws of physics that make the show possible. And now that curtain, it's shaking. Because once you know who taught who, you start asking who's been eating off whose genius this whole time. Part 8. See, they told you civilization started in Europe. Marble statues, olive wreaths, philosophers in white robes staring at the sky like they invented thinking. But let's rewind that tape. Slow it down. Zoom in. Before Greece was even Greece, before they had a word for philosophy, Africa was already doing surgery, mapping the stars, measuring the Nile's moods, building in stone so precise you still can't slip a razor blade between those blocks. While Europe was still trying to figure out how not to freeze to erase every winter, Kemet was writing on papyrus, charting the soul, studying the brain, naming every bone in the human body like an old friend. They call it Greek philosophy. I call it African memory with a Greek accent. Pythagoras. He studied in Kemet, came to the Nile like a thirsty man to a river that never runs dry, learned from African priests, then went back home and they crowned him genius. Plato. He walked through temples where the walls were older than his whole bloodline. He sat at the feet of African masters, then went back to Athens, and they called it the Academy. Europe writes it like Greece looked south once, took a few notes, and went back home inspired. No, they camped out. They studied. They copied. They rebranded. Africa was the blueprint. Europe was the marketing team. They took black ink on brown papyrus, turned it into white marble on museum floors, and told the world, this is where it began. They dug up our scrolls, read our medicine, our math, our myths, then buried the authors and spotlighted the students. Picture it. On one side of the sea, Africans in linen, reading the language of the stars, timing the flood, balancing spirit and science like it's nothing. On the other side, Europe fumbling in the dark, calling lightning magic, and disease a curse, waiting centuries to catch up to what Nile Valley children learned before puberty. But open a school book today and watch the magic trick. The river becomes a footnote. The temples become influences. The masters become mysterious natives. Greece takes center stage on a script Africa wrote. This is not hate. This is correction. You can't call it Western thought when the roots are planted deep in African soil. You can't praise the fruit and ignore the tree. Europe put on a toga and got a standing ovation. Africa laid the foundation and got written out the playbill, but that's why the curtain is shaking. Now, because once you see that the father of philosophy was a student in African halls, once you know those Greek gods got their swag from older African stories, once you realize those great discoveries were rediscoveries, you stop bowing. You start questioning. You start tracing the river back to its source. And that river, it doesn't start in Athens. It doesn't start in Rome. It starts where the sun greets the land like an old friend. It starts in Africa. Part 9. Europe likes to start the story in marble, white statues, white columns, white lies. But before Greece had a word for philosophy, Kemet had already mapped the mind, the stars, the spirit, the soil. Before Plato thought, Africans knew. Listen, when Europe was still fumbling with fire and fear, Africa was out here measuring the heavens with shadows and stone, teaching math with pyramids, writing in pictures that spoke to gods and grandchildren at the same time. They call it Greek philosophy. We call it stolen homework with the name rubbed off. Pythagoras? That triangle you learned in school. He didn't dream that in some quiet Greek village. He studied in Kemet, sat at the feet of priests who could weigh a soul and a star in the same breath. Herodotus, father of history. He walked through Egypt with his mouth open, eyes wide, taking notes like a tourist who knew he was standing in the library of the world. They turned African temples into mystery schools. They turned black genius into ancient wisdom. No credit, just copies. Understand this. Greece was the student that forged the teacher's signature. They took African science, wrapped it in togas, and called it Western. They took African gods, changed the names, lightened the faces, and called it mythology. They took African stories of Al-Sar, Al-Set, Heru, cut them up, washed them in Europe, and brought them back as something new. But you can't bury the Nile with a footnote. You can't erase a continent with a chapter heading. While Europe was still figuring out how to bathe more than once a season, Africans were out here aligning temples with the solstice, performing surgery, counting years by the rhythm of the stars. They say Greek medicine. But Imhotep was diagnosing and documenting when their ancestors were still arguing with thunder. They say Greek geometry. But you don't stack 2.3 million stones into a pyramid by guessing. They say Greek philosophy. But what is philosophy if not know thyself? And who carved that into stone, into spirit, into civilization, long before Socrates ever opened his mouth? Africa did. The difference is this. Europe builds statues of men and calls them gods. Africa builds nations of gods and calls them people. Europe writes history like it started when they walked in the room. Africa is history. The room, the walls, the floor, the blueprint. So when they tell you civilization began in Greece, understand that's not a fact. That's a marketing campaign. The truth, Greece was a branch. Africa was the root. And no matter how high they lift their story, the fruit still answers to the soil. Part 10. Europe wrote, once upon a time, we were the first, the brightest, the chosen. Africa laughed, a deep, old laugh. The kind that remembers when the Nile was the world's main highway, and Greece was still learning how to say civilization without stuttering. Let's strip the costume off the story. Europe was the student posing as the teacher. Africa was the library they snuck into at night. They came to Kemet, to Black Egypt, eyes wide, hands open, scrolls empty. They sat at the feet of African priests, African engineers, African astronomers who were charting the stars before Europe even had a full alphabet. They studied in temples where the walls were older than their myths, where the ceilings mapped constellations they'd later rename and claim as their own. They took notes. They took symbols. They took gods, changed the names, lightened the faces, and called it Greek thought. Pythagoras didn't dream that theorem under some olive tree. He learned his math from Nile Valley mines who were measuring land, building pyramids, and aligning stone with starlight while his homeland was still trying to count without fingers. Plato and them weren't just thinking deep in some cave. They walked through African schools where soul, science, and spirit were one language. They took philosophy seasoned for centuries in the sun, watered it down, served it back to the world as Western wisdom. Europe, look what we created. Africa, look what you copied. They called our gods myths, then remixed them into their own pantheon. They called our science mystery, then turned around and built their logic on the same principles. They erased the melanin from the murals, buried the blackness of the builders, then wrote textbooks pretending the Nile was just a river and not a university. Understand this. When Greece looked up, it saw African sky. When Greece did math, it used African numbers. When Greece spoke wisdom, it echoed African proverbs. They were guests in our house who walked off with the furniture and then swore they invented sitting. Europe was the echo. Africa was the voice. Europe was the borrowed light. Africa was the sun. So, when they say Western civilization, hear what they're not saying. African foundation with European narration. They wrote us out the script, but the stones still talk. The temples still stand. The stars still line up with African intention. You can bury the credit, but you can't bury the source. Greece was a chapter. Africa was the book. And every time they quote their classics, they're really whispering our name under their breath. Part 11. Europe was the echo. Africa was the voice. They call it Western civilization, like it fell from the sky wrapped in a toga signed by some Zeus-looking professor with marble abs and blue eyes. But let's rewind the tape. Before Plato was deep, there were black scribes scratching light into stone. Before Pythagoras discovered triangles, Africans were measuring stars, splitting land, aligning temples with the heartbeat of the Nile. They showed up late to a party we'd been hosting for thousands of years, then wrote their names on the wall like they owned the house. Europe was still arguing with its own darkness, still wrestling with cold winters and empty libraries, while Africa was running universities before they even had a word for university. They sailed south and east with empty notebooks, wide eyes, and hungry minds. They sat at the feet of black priests, black astronomers, black philosophers, black healers, asking questions, taking notes, filling their cups from a river they now pretend they discovered. Then they went back home, dusted off their sandals, and told the world, "Look what we made." No footnotes, no credits, no mention of the temples whose floors they walked or the black hands that lit their lanterns. They turned Kemet into Egypt, turned Neteru into gods, turned Medu Neter into hieroglyphics, like it was some cute puzzle instead of a living language of a living people. They took our science, called it philosophy, took our medicine, called it mystery, took our spirituality, called it myth. When it was African, they called it superstition. When they repackaged it, they called it enlightenment. See the game? Europe builds statues of men who studied us. Africa builds civilizations those men could only study. They praise Socrates for asking questions, but never praise the Nile Valley for having the answers long before he was born. They kneel at the altar of Aristotle, but won't admit his library card was stamped by Africa. They'll tell you Greece is the cradle of civilization, like Africa wasn't already grown, walking, talking, building, mapping the cosmos, raising pyramids so precise you still can't slide a razor between the stones. Cradle? No. If anything, Greece was the nursery. Africa was the ancestor rocking that cradle. So when they say Western thought, hear African memory in a European mask. When they say classical education, hear African wisdom dressed in a white robe for European comfort. They studied under our sun, then tried to bury the source and worship the shadow. But a shadow can't erase the body that cast it. They can keep the marble statues, the columns, the myths, the stolen shine. We know the soil those roots drank from. We know the drum behind their logic. We know the black hands behind their genius. Europe was the remix. Africa was the original track. And no matter how loud they blast their version, the baseline of history still spells our name. Part 12. Europe wrote footnotes. Africa carved scriptures in stone. They built statues of thinkers. We built civilizations that made thought a lifestyle. They brag about Western philosophy. We were doing soul mathematics when their ancestors were still arguing with fire. Let's talk plain. Before Greece was great, their best and brightest were students kneeling at Nile-side universities they now call mystery. Pythagoras studied in Kemet, learned from priests who measured the earth with nothing but stars and patience. He went home with our homework, signed his name at the top, and they called it genius. Plato walked through Egyptian temples lined with knowledge so old it made his Republic look like a rough draft. He stared at walls that held geometry, astronomy, ethics, politics, all etched in stone while Europe still didn't know how to wash properly. Aristotle. That man's library was stacked with African scrolls. He read us like a thief in a jewelry store, eyes wide, pockets open, then stepped out the door wearing our gold like a family heirloom. They called Kemet Egypt, called theft influence, called plagiarism birth of Western thought. No, let's call it what it is. Europe was the student who forged the teacher's signature. Africa was the classroom, the textbook, the lab, the lecture, and the language. They had marble. We had meaning. They built columns. We built cosmos. They painted gods that looked like them. We understood God as rhythm, order, ma'at. Balance so deep even the stars moved on beat. While they were drawing stickmen on pottery, we were aligning pyramids with Orion, mapping out the sky like a second skin, performing surgery, counting time, measuring floods, and writing it all down in scripts they still can't fully decode. But open a textbook today and watch the magic trick. Africa fades to the background, Greece walks on stage in a white robe, and suddenly the story starts in Europe. They say Western civilization began with the Greeks. Translation: we stepped into a library built by Africans, lit one candle, and called ourselves the sun. Nah, we remember. We remember that when Greek scholars wanted initiation into the highest sciences, they traveled south, not north. They crossed seas and deserts to sit at the feet of black sages who could read the heavens like a book with no last page. We remember that the Nile was the first Ivy League. Admission cost, humility, discipline, years of study under elders who answered to no king in Europe. We remember that the word Europe was a rumor when Africa was already a reference. So when they talk about Greek miracles, understand, miracles don't grow out of nowhere. They grow from roots, and those roots were sunk deep in black soil. Europe was the echo. Africa was the voice. Europe was the translation. Africa was the language. Europe was the screenshot. Africa was the live stream. They can keep trying to crop us out the frame, but history is a wide-angle lens. Zoom out far enough and you'll see it clear. Before they built their Parthenon, we raised pyramids that still refuse to fall. Before they wrote philosophy, we lived wisdom so advanced they had to repackage it just to understand a fraction. So no, the Greeks didn't discover civilization. They visited it, studied under it, took notes, went home. Europe was the remix. Africa wrote the sheet music, owned the studio, and invented the sound. And the more they try to mute that truth, the louder our drums become. Part 13. They keep telling you Western civilization began in Greece. Nah, Greece began in Kemet. Let's talk about it. Before Plato had a republic, our ancestors already ran empires. Before Pythagoras drew a triangle, our builders were laying pyramids with angles so clean they still shame modern tools. See, Europe came to the Nile like a freshman sneaking into a masterclass. Wide-eyed, note-taking, front row, silent. They studied under black priests who held libraries in their minds and star maps in their souls. Greece didn't discover philosophy. They sat at the feet of African thinkers who were already dissecting the soul, mapping the heavens, and decoding the laws of Ma'at: truth, balance, order, justice. While Europe was still arguing with the weather, they'll tell you Aristotle was a genius, but they won't tell you he walked through Egyptian temples lined with books and scrolls, learning from a system so advanced it made his original ideas look like footnotes. They'll praise Hippocrates, father of medicine, but stay quiet about Imhotep, the African polymath who was diagnosing, operating, and writing medical texts thousands of years before some Greeks even knew how to bathe properly. Europe showed up late to the party, then tried to act like host. Africa had universities before Europe had sidewalks. Africa had law before Europe had language for justice. Africa had astronomy before Europe stopped fearing the dark. They call it Greek mythology. But those gods and stories, remixed from the Nile, renamed, rebranded, like taking the drum and calling it a new instrument. They copied our math, then erased our names. They copied our science, then buried our faces. They copied our symbols, then told the world we were just mystical, never mathematical. Understand this. Europe is the echo. Africa is the voice. They built marble statues trying to sculpt perfection. We carved civilization into stone, stars, and spirit. They had city-states. We had continents in conversation. They had great thinkers. We had entire cultures of genius, where the farmer, the builder, the healer all carried ancient knowledge like sacred code in their blood. But when the story got retold, they cropped Africa out the frame, zoomed in on Greece, blurred the Nile, turned the original into a footnote. So now they teach your children that the Greeks brought light to the world while ignoring the sun that trained them. Let's be clear. Greece was a student. Africa was the teacher. Europe was the remix. Africa was the rhythm, the melody, the bass line, the whole damn orchestra. And every time they try to crown Greece as the birthplace of reason, remember, You can't be the parent of a child who already had grandparents. This isn't about hate. It's about history, about taking back the mic from those who dubbed over our verses and called it their album. Because once you know that the same people they called primitive taught the ones they call civilized, the whole illusion cracks. And in that crack, Africa steps through, head high, voice steady, saying, "I was the blueprint before you learned to draw." Part 14. Europe been walking around this earth like it woke up first. Like history started when some Greeks picked up a pen and wrote their own names in bold. But listen close. Before Plato ever pondered, before Pythagoras drew his little triangle, before Hippocrates swore any oath, there were black hands in Kemet measuring the stars, splitting the seasons, mapping the human body like a sacred river. They tell you, Europe gave the world philosophy. Nah, Europe just put its logo on African thought and called it Western. They tell you, Greece is the cradle of civilization. Cradle? Greece was the daycare. Africa was the mother. Those Greek boys sailed down the Nile like students sneaking A's into night school, sat at the feet of African priests, scribes, healers, astronomers, and took notes like their lives depended on it. Europe came with questions. Africa already had systems. They came with myths. We had mathematics. They came with what if. We had here's how. They walked into temples where walls were libraries, where every stone spoke a science, and they copied the homework, then graded themselves with A+ while calling the teacher savage. Imagine that. The apprentice writing the story as if the master never existed. So now they put marble statues on the cover and hide the black stone underneath. They praise Socrates for thinking deeply, but never mention the Nile Valley schools where thinking deeply was basic entry level. They lift up Euclid but skip over the surveyors of Kemet who bent geometry around a flooding river and still hit every boundary line exact. They quote Aristotle, but don't say he studied in libraries stacked by black minds and then turned around and called those same people less than. That's the trick. Erase the source. Worship the copy. Europe sells you a statue. Africa built the quarry. Europe gives you a chapter. Africa wrote the language they use for the title. So when they say, be grateful for Greek wisdom, I just smile and say, tell the whole story then. Tell them how your founding fathers were foreign exchange students on African soil. Tell them how your enlightenment was a late sunrise on a continent that had already seen 1,000 dawns. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The ones they painted as the peak were climbing African stairs. The ones they crowned as the source were drinking from African wells. Europe was busy naming the constellations. Africa was the one who first mapped the sky. Europe was busy arguing about the soul. Africa was already aligning spirit, body, and cosmos in temples that still stand after empires turn to dust. So no, we're not here to beg for a footnote in their textbook. We're here to flip the script, roll the credits back, and let the world see who lit the first light they've been claiming as theirs. Because under every Greek tale, there's an African whisper. And this time, we're turning the whisper into thunder. Part 15. They told you civilization started in Europe, like the world was black and blank until a Greek picked up a pen. Nah, let's rewind that lie, slow it down, frame by frame. Before Plato had a thought, Kemet had a library. Before Aristotle discovered logic, Africans were mapping the stars, measuring the Nile's moods, building in stone with math so clean it still embarrasses computers. Europe was in the dark, cold, fragmented, tribes wrestling with fire and fear, while along the Nile people were calculating eternity, writing in stone, turning sand into science, and spirit into statecraft. But here's how the story got flipped. Greek boys took study abroad trips to African temples. Yeah, let that sit. Your founding fathers of Western thought were foreign exchange students in black universities carved in limestone. They sat at the feet of African priests, scribes, healers, engineers, men and women who understood the body, the soul, the sky, the soil. Pythagoras, he didn't wake up one day and just see triangles. He went to Kemet, studied with African masters, then came home like he invented the angle. Plato, student of Socrates, who learned from those who walked Egyptian halls, reading wisdom off temple walls older than his whole bloodline. They drank from the Nile, then bottled it as Greek, stole the flavor, changed the label, and told the world it was imported from the West. Europe was busy calling Africa savage while copying her homework line for line. Africa was building clocks out of shadows, aligning pyramids with Orion, tracking Sirius before telescopes had names, and Europe was still arguing about which god owned the thunder. Africa was embalming bodies with chemistry so advanced we still can't fully decode it, while Europe was praying not to die from a cut and a cold winter. Africa was writing on papyrus and stone, documenting medicine, law, philosophy, while Europe was mostly oral, and then had the nerve to call Africa primitive. Understand this. When Greece rose, it rose on African shoulders. When Europe bragged about reason, it was echoing African rhythm. When they praised their enlightenment, they forgot to mention who lit the first flame. The Greeks came south like students, left like masters, and Europe later showed up like a thief with a paintbrush, repainting the whole story white and Western. They erased the black from the blueprint, buried the Nile in their footnotes, and turned African teachers into Greek genius. But the stone remembers, the temples remember, the language remembers. The timelines don't lie, only the textbooks do. Europe is the remix. Africa is the original track. Europe is the echo. Africa is the voice. Europe is the borrowed light. Africa is the sun. So when they say Greece gave the world philosophy, ask them, who taught Greece to think? When they say Europe birthed science, ask them, who measured the heavens before Europe knew its own reflection in water? They built statues of Greeks and buried the black roots under marble and myth, but we're here now, dusting off. The stone, pulling receipts from the sand, reminding the world. The first classrooms were African. The first libraries were African. The first equations, first surgeries, first mapped constellations, African. Europe studied. Africa originated. And if that truth makes the old story shake, good. Let it crumble. Because you can't keep calling theft inspiration. And you can't keep calling Africa the dark continent when all your light came from her. Next time they whisper, thank the Greeks, you say, thank the Nile. Part 16. Europe got museums. Africa got memories. They got glass cases, white walls, soft lights, and little plaques that lie with confidence. We got grandmothers who never read a book but can recite 10,000 years through a song, through a proverb, through a side eye that says, I was there before they started counting time. Europe got classics. Africa got origins. They teach you civilization began in Greece. We look at the pyramids and laugh in hieroglyphics. How you start with Plato when Imhotep been building step pyramids while Europe was still arguing with the weather. How you praise Pythagoras for triangles when Nubian architects were measuring stars, aligning stone with Orion, turning math into monuments you can see from space. They tell you Aristotle, father of logic, but he studied in Kemet, sat in libraries stacked with black genius, scrolls on medicine, alchemy, geometry, philosophy, before his people could even spell philosophy. They don't say stole, they say borrowed, they say influenced, they say inspired by. No, they took names off scrolls, took black gods, painted them pale, renamed the chapters, and called it Western thought. Europe got credit. Africa got amnesia forced on her. They erased your face from your own story, then sold you the remix with a British accent and a marble statue. They built Europe's Renaissance on Africa's receipts. Gold from Mali paid for cathedrals. Knowledge from Kemet built their universities. Bodies from West Africa fueled their economies. Europe got rich. Africa got raided. They called their theft discovery, their lies curriculum, their propaganda education. And now you sit in classrooms writing essays about Greek genius while your ancestors watch from the Nile saying, child, they learning from your stolen notebook and grading you on it. Europe got stories. Africa got evidence. Obelisks in Paris, sarcophagi in London, Benin, bronzes in Berlin, manuscripts from Timbuktu hidden in European basements like guilty secrets. They tour the world showing off your mother's jewelry, calling it World Heritage, but the world never got permission. Understand this. Before Zeus had thunder, Ra had sunrise. Before Athena birthed from a skull, Isis was resurrecting kings and teaching magic to the cosmos. Before Socrates asked questions, African priests been decoding the soul by reading the stars in the river. Europe is the echo. Africa is the voice. Europe is the photocopy. Africa is the manuscript. Europe is the chorus singing off-key with stolen lyrics. Africa is the drum that birthed the rhythm they trying to imitate. So when they say Greek philosophy, you say Egyptian library. When they say Western science, you say Nile Valley experiments. When they say European enlightenment, you say somebody turned on an African light switch. They want you to believe Africa was late to the party. Truth is, Africa built the house, lit the fire, cooked the food, then got locked outside while Europe took selfies in the living room. But the lock is rusting, the lies are cracking, and the ancestors are clearing their throat. This time, when the story is told, Africa won't be the footnote. Africa is the headline, and the world gonna have to read it. Part 17. Europe loves to brag like it woke up one morning and invented thinking, like philosophy just fell from the sky into a white man's lap. But let's rewind. Let's walk this thing back to the Nile. Before Greece had a name, Kemet had pyramids kissing the sun, temples older than their myths, libraries carved in stone, math dancing in the angles of every brick. Europe was still figuring out how to wash regular, while Africa was charting stars, mapping the afterlife, measuring the soul. They call it Greek philosophy. We call it African wisdom, wearing a stolen passport. Pythagoras, that man studied in Kemet. He ain't dreamed that theorem out of thin air. He sat at the feet of priests who had been playing with triangles since his ancestors were chasing goats. Plato. He heard about Atlantis, but never told you the real lost world was black on the Nile, with columns so tall they made men feel like ants. Herodotus walked through Egypt eyes wide, jaw dropped, calling it the land of wonders. He saw medicine, geometry, cosmology, spiritual science. Then Europe turned his travel notes into a magic trick. Now you see Africa, now you don't. They studied under African masters, then went home and signed their own names on black genius. Europe wrote, "The Greeks discovered," history replied, "Stop lying." The truth, Greece was the student, Africa was the school. Europe, stone houses, small ships, short memory. Africa, stone monuments, great rivers, long memory. Europe told the world, civilization started with us. Africa just smiled, like an elder watching a child wear his shoes, because while Europe was painting gods to look like themselves, Africa was teaching that the divine lives in balance, in Ma'at, in order, in truth. They came to the Nile like thirsty men, drank deep from black fountains, then went back north and acted like the water was theirs. They erased the black faces off the walls, chipped noses, bleached the story, turned pharaohs into mystery, turned Africans into workers, turned teachers into labor. But listen, you can white out the paper, you can bury the bones, you can rename the gods, but you can't rewrite the sun. The same sun that bronzed those builders, fed those scribes, lit those temples, is still testifying every morning. Europe likes to talk like it's the father of reason, but reason was born on African soil, swaddled in papyrus, rocked to sleep by the Nile. They call it Western thought. We call it African memory in a European accent. So when they quote Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, hear the echo. Hear the Nile in the background. Hear the drums under the marble. Because behind every Greek miracle is an African blueprint. They built statues to their thinkers. We built civilizations to our ideas. Europe carved names in stone. Africa carved knowledge into the very laws of nature. And now, as the dust clears, as the lies crack, as the receipts surface, the world gon' learn. Greece was the remix. Africa was the original track. And this time, when we spin the record, we saying names right. We putting the credit back where it belongs. On the black hands that measured the heavens, on the black minds that mapped the soul, on the black genius they tried to bury under marble and myth. The headline, not Greek glory. The headline is Africa taught the teachers. Africa schooled the scholars. Africa lit the torch they keep pretending they invented. Part 18. Europe loves to talk like it woke up first. Like history started when a Greek picked up a pen. Like thought was born in Athens and died in Rome, and everything before that was just myth and mystery. But let's clear the smoke. Before Plato was deep, Africans were mapping the stars. Before Socrates asked, "What is justice?" Ma'at had already laid down truth, balance, order, on stone, on spirit, on society. Europe built statues. Africa built civilizations. They say Western philosophy. I say nice remix. Because those same Greeks they worship in textbooks were students on African soil. They crossed the Mediterranean like thirsty men crossing a desert, begging for water from a Nile that had been overflowing with wisdom for thousands of years. Pythagoras, he didn't discover that triangle game in a dream. He sat in Kemet under African priests who'd been measuring land, balancing pyramids on perfect angles, long before he had a name worth remembering. Plato. He wasn't just sitting in a cave imagining shadows. He heard whispers of Atlantis from African mouths that remembered floods, kingdoms, and lost coasts. Europe still calls legend because it can't face the receipts. Europe wrote it down. Africa lived it out. They came to our temples like tourists, left like scholars, then went home and acted like founders. Like they built the house when all they did was change the curtains and sign their names on the front door. They call it Greek medicine. But Imhotep was diagnosing, cutting, stitching, stacking stone into sky while Europe was still trying to figure out which god to blame for a headache. They call it Greek geometry. But geometry is just a Greek suit on an African body. Geo means earth. Africa was the earth they measured, the flood they studied, the land they mapped so they could pretend later that they invented, the compass of the mind. Europe loves to archive. Africa embodies. See the difference? They write theories. We wrote pyramids. They scribbled on scrolls. We carved into eternity. And when the smoke of time cleared, Europe held the microphone. Africa held the memory. They painted us as primitive, while they stole our principles. They called our gods myths, while they renamed them philosophy and got tenure. Understand this, the Greeks weren't the beginning. They were the echo, the reflection on the water, not the sun in the sky. Africa was the syllabus. Kemet was the campus. The temples were the textbooks they couldn't read without us. So when they say, Europe gave the world reason, I laugh. Because reason was already seated on a granite throne by the Nile, wearing gold, holding a staff. While Europe was still afraid of the dark, Europe dressed it up. Africa birthed it. They came to Africa as students, left as plagiarists, and centuries later, their children still act like we're late to a party we actually started. Africa taught the teachers. Africa schooled the scholars. Africa lit the torch they keep pretending they invented. And that's why they keep rewriting the story. Because if the world remembers who the real teacher is, who the first classroom was, who the original mind belonged to, then every stolen chapter in their Western civilization book starts to look less like genius and more like a well-dressed robbery. Part 19. Europe showed up late to a party Africa had already cleaned up from. By the time Greece was learning how to spell philosophy, Kemet had already mapped the stars, measured the Nile's heartbeat, and written math in stone. They walked into temples like tourists with notebooks, staring at walls they could barely read, copying what they didn't create, then went home and signed their own names at the bottom. They call it Greek philosophy. I call it African memory with a European accent. Pythagoras? That man studied in Kemet like a freshman begging for office hours. Came back with African equations, and they crowned him a genius for doing homework our ancestors wrote centuries before. Plato sat in Egyptian halls while priests broke down the soul like it was basic arithmetic. He took those lessons, dressed them in togas, and Europe called it the Republic, like Ma'at hadn't already laid out law, balance, justice in the language of the Nile. Aristotle, library raider, student of stolen scrolls. He built his logic on blueprints drafted by black minds who carved their wisdom into obelisks and pyramids while Europe was still trying to remember which god did what. See, Europe wrote myths. Africa wrote manuals. Europe dreamed of Olympus, gods drunk and jealous on a mountaintop. Africa raised pyramids, cosmic calendars of stone, lining up with Orion like the sky was a contract we helped design. Europe guessed at the heavens. Africa measured them. Europe argued about the soul. Africa mapped it, named it, weighed it against a feather, and built a whole moral universe around balance and truth. Europe played with shadows on cave walls and called it enlightenment. Africa walked in full sun and called it everyday life. But when the Greeks came home, they didn't say, "We learned from black masters on the Nile." No, they scrubbed the melanin off the story, bleached the credits, and told the world they were the first ones to think. That's how the theft works. They don't just take the gold, they erase the miner. They don't just steal the book, they bury the author. They turned African libraries into European legends, African teachers into mysterious influences, African science into ancient superstition, until a whiteface repeats it. Then suddenly it becomes reason, logic, civilization. But look closely. Scratch the marble, you'll find mud from the Nile. Dust the statue, you'll see the outline of a darker face they tried to chisel away. Europe built museums full of African memory, then told the children of Africa they had no history. They teach you Greece as the sunrise and Africa as the dark. But the truth? Africa was the sun, Greece was just the mirror trying to claim the light. Part 20. They told you civilization was born in marble. White. Columns. White statues. White lies. They said wisdom walked out of Athens fully grown like it just appeared one day. No mother, no father, no source. But truth doesn't stay buried. It rises. It returns. It remembers. Before Plato was philosopher, he was just a student standing in Kemet, eyes wide, notebook open, learning geometry from priests who measured the Nile before Greece had a name. Before Pythagoras had a theorem, he had a teacher, and that teacher had a temple. And that temple had walls covered in equations, star maps, sacred math, written in a language Europe later called mystery because it couldn't read it. Before Aristotle wrote about ethics and soul, he was studying scrolls taken from African libraries, knowledge smuggled, translated, repackaged, sold back to the world with the price tag switched and the label Greek slapped on the front. They called Africa myth while they built their facts on stolen blueprints. Understand this. Those Greek thinkers, they were not the beginning. They were the echo. They were the remix. They were the students who walked into black classrooms, took notes, went home, and then erased the teacher's name from the board. They stood in the shadow of African temples, studied African science, prayed in African mysteries, then went home and called it Western civilization. Let's be plain. Greece was the apprentice. Africa was the master. Greece was the visitor. Africa was the house. Greece was the translation. Africa was the original tongue. But somewhere along the line, the story got flipped. The thief became the genius. The source became the footnote. The mother became the maid in her own child's story. They erased the black from the blueprint, bleached the gods, reshaped the noses on the statues, called it restoration, when it was really historical surgery, cutting Africa out of her own reflection. Yet the ruins still talk. The stones still hum. The pyramids still stand there, unbothered, older than every Greek myth, older than every European empire, pointing to the sky like, I was here before your story began. Look at the timeline. Kemet was solving engineering problems while Europe was still trying to survive winter. African doctors were doing surgery while the rest of the world was blaming demons. African astronomers were charting the heavens while others thought stars were just holes in the sky. And then invaders came. Libraries burned, names buried, scrolls scattered. But knowledge doesn't die. It travels, sometimes in chains, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in the mouth of the very people who stole it. So when they say Greek philosophy, here, African thought, translated with an accent. When they say Western science, here, Nile Valley experiments, rebranded and repackaged. When they say European enlightenment, Remember, you can't light a candle without a flame that came before it, and that flame was African. This is not about hate. This is about credit, about balance, about putting the name tag back on the chest of the one who actually did the work, because the people erased from their past are easier to control in the present. If you think your ancestors did nothing, you'll accept anything. If you believe your lineage is empty, you'll bow to anyone who claims to be full. But when you know, not guess, not hope, know that your people measured the stars, mapped the body, organized the calendar, built in stone what others couldn't even dream in wood, then your back straightens, your voice deepens, your doubt begins to crack. You stop begging for a seat at the table because you remember. Your people carved the first table out of the first tree by the first river that the world ever called holy. So let's say it without stutter. Yes, the Greeks studied in Africa. Yes, they sat at Blackfeet. Yes, they carried African books back across the sea. Yes, they built a culture on borrowed brilliance. They learned from us, then tried to erase us. But you can't erase the sun and keep the daylight. You can't bury the root and keep the tree standing. You can't steal the drum and silence the rhythm in our blood, because even when the story is twisted, the truth leaks through the cracks, in the math, in the myths, in the architecture, in the language, in the way the world still faces the Nile when it talks about mystery. So here we are now, picking up the pieces, dusting off the names, calling the ancestors back to the front of the stage, not for nostalgia, for alignment. You are not the afterthought of history. You are the opening chapter they tried to tear out. You are not standing in the shadow of Greece. Greece was standing in the morning light of Africa. And that's the part they don't teach. That's the verse they cut from the hymn. That's the scene they left on the editing room floor when they made the movie called Western Civilization. But the reel is rewinding now. The missing footage is rolling. The credits are being corrected. And as the screen fades, as the lights come up, as you look at your own reflection differently, remember this. Africa was the sun. Greece was just the mirror trying to claim the light. Say it again so the lie feels small. Africa was the sun. Greece was just the mirror trying to claim the light. One more time, for every burned library, every broken nose on every stolen statue, every child who never heard their true inheritance, Africa was the sun. Greece was just the mirror trying to claim the light.